Ronda Rousey walked into a bar to relax, but a gang of bikers spotted her right away. They thought they could easily intimidate one woman. However, their confidence quickly vanished when one of them tried to use force. What happened next shocked everyone. Watch to the end, and don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by the thick darkness of the night. The hum of the tires against the pavement was steady, rhythmic, the only companion to the driver behind the wheel. The dashboard clock flickered, almost midnight. The fuel gauge still had enough, but the exhaustion of the road weighed heavy. A neon sign appeared in the distance, flickering weakly against the black horizon. The letters had long since lost their full glow, leaving behind a broken, stuttering message barely readable against the night. The parking lot was half full, lined with motorcycles, a few semi-trucks, and an old rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The place had the kind of presence that warned outsiders to keep driving, but she didn't. Ronda pulled into the lot, her car rolling to a stop near the edge. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel lightly, surveying the building through the windshield. The exterior was what she expected: weathered wood, windows coated in a thin layer of dust and grime, a doorway worn from years of boots kicking it open. Places like this were all the same. They smelled of cheap beer and burnt grease, filled with men who had nothing better to do than drink and trade old war stories about the roads and fights they'd been in. She had been to enough of them before to know what to expect. The moment she stepped out of the car, the sound of cicadas filled the air, buzzing in the summer heat. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of spilled fuel and asphalt, mixing with the ever-present dust that lingered on roads like this. The night was still, too quiet, the way places like this often were, waiting for something to break the silence. She walked toward the entrance, her steps steady, unhurried. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here for anything except a break from the road, a cup of coffee, and maybe a moment of quiet. But she could already feel the eyes on her before she even touched the door. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, a mix of old, yellowed lights and a flickering TV in the corner, playing a boxing match no one seemed to be watching. The air smelled of sweat, tobacco, and fried food, thick with the kind of atmosphere that had soaked into the walls over the years. The wooden floors were scuffed, the bar itself lined with the same regulars that could probably be found here every night, their places marked by the same worn-out seats and half-empty glasses. Behind the counter, a man who looked old enough to have seen 1,000 nights like this was wiping down a glass. His face was lined, his expression unreadable. He barely acknowledged her entrance, only a glance before returning to his routine. This was the kind of place where people minded their own business, unless given a reason not to. She moved to the bar, took a seat, rested her arms loosely on the counter. The chair creaked slightly beneath her as she settled. The bartender approached, still wiping the same glass, and looked at her. "Coffee," she said. He nodded, no small talk, no hesitation, and turned to pour. The heat of the bar pressed around her, thick and heavy, the murmur of voices low, carrying stories she had no interest in. The clink of glasses, the scrape of boots against the floor, the occasional burst of laughter. It was all background noise. She focused only on the coffee, the warmth of the cup against her fingers as she lifted it, taking a slow sip. She could feel the shift before she saw it. The change in atmosphere was subtle at first, laughter fading slightly, voices lowering, an unspoken awareness filling the air. The feeling of being watched became stronger, more deliberate. She didn't turn immediately. She had been in situations like this before, knew what it meant when a room full of men suddenly paid attention to the one person who didn't fit. From the corner of her eye, she saw them. A group of them, seated at a corner table, all wearing the same faded leather jackets, the same patches sewn into the fabric. They had the look of men who had spent more nights in places like this than anywhere else, men who belonged here. They weren't drunk, not yet, but there was an edge to the way they sat, the way their eyes followed her, the way they spoke just a little too loudly for it to be anything other than intentional. One of them leaned forward, said something to the others, and they laughed. Another nodded in her direction, a smirk spreading across his face. They weren't just watching her, they were waiting for something. She took another sip of her coffee, still not turning, still not reacting. It was always the same in places like this. Men like that always thought they owned the space around them. They thrived on the idea that someone like her, someone alone, someone who didn't immediately acknowledge them, was an opportunity, a challenge. She heard the scrape of a chair, the heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor. Someone had stood up. She didn't have to guess who it was. The bartender didn't say anything. He had probably seen this kind of thing 100 times before. Maybe he already knew how it would end. She waited for the moment they decided to close the distance. It didn't take long. The heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor was deliberate, unhurried. A movement meant to be heard, to signal presence before words were spoken. The air in the bar remained thick with the usual sounds, clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the distant hum of the jukebox struggling to play through old speakers. But beneath it, something shifted. A current ran through the room, a silent acknowledgement that something was about to unfold. Ronda didn't turn immediately. She didn't need to. She could already map out the space in her mind. The way the men at the corner table had shifted their weight forward, the brief pauses in conversation from the nearby regulars, the way the bartender kept wiping the same spot on the counter, pretending not to see. She knew the type of men who walked like that, with the slow confidence of someone who had never had to question their control over a room. The first one reached her first. He slid into the stool beside her, his presence thick with amusement. She could smell the alcohol on him, not overpowering, but enough to suggest he had settled into the kind of buzz that made men like him feel invincible. His leather jacket creaked as he leaned onto the bar, his elbow resting on the counter as if he had just casually decided to start a conversation. "Well, well," he said, his voice coated in that familiar tone of someone who thought they were charming. "Didn't expect to see someone like you here." Ronda didn't acknowledge him. She took another sip of her coffee, her fingers relaxed around the handle. The second man arrived a moment later, his footsteps heavier, more deliberate. He positioned himself on the other side of her, effectively bracketing her in. His size was more intimidating than the first, a man built thick, his arms covered in faded tattoos, the kind that told stories only understood by those who had lived a certain kind of life. He let out a low chuckle, as if the situation itself amused him. "You lost, sweetheart?" She remained still, her posture completely at ease. There was no need to respond. Silence was often more powerful than words in situations like this. The moment a person engaged, they played into the game, and she had no interest in playing. The first man, the thinner one, smirked at her lack of response. He turned slightly toward the others at the table, who were watching with clear amusement. One of them lifted his beer in mock salute. "She's shy," the man beside her said, shaking his head. "That's cute." The bartender still said nothing, his face unreadable. He wasn't going to intervene. This wasn't his fight, and he had probably learned long ago that stepping in only led to trouble. The bigger man beside her shifted, his knee knocking slightly against her stool. The movement was casual, but not accidental. "Come on," he said, his voice lower now, a hint of impatience creeping in. "Don't be rude, we're just being friendly." She let the silence linger a beat longer before finally setting her coffee cup down. Her fingers rested lightly on the counter, her posture still completely at ease. The first man, the one who had spoken first, glanced down at her hand, waiting for her to respond, to acknowledge them. When she didn't, he exhaled through his nose, his smirk faltering just slightly. And then he reached out. It wasn't a harsh grab, not yet. Just a touch, his fingers closing lightly over her forearm in a gesture meant to establish control, to make her acknowledge him. The bar seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of moment that felt small but wasn't. The kind of moment where choices were made, where lines were drawn, whether people realized it or not. Ronda's eyes flicked downward just for a fraction of a second, taking in the placement of his hand. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, she lifted her gaze to meet his. For the first time since he had approached, she acknowledged him, and the moment she did, he realized his mistake. There was something in her expression, not anger, not fear, not even irritation, just absolute, unwavering control. The smirk on his lips twitched, faltered. His fingers tensed slightly around her wrist, as if some part of him instinctively knew to let go, but couldn't yet bring himself to do it. The larger man beside her shifted, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but he wasn't fast enough. Ronda moved. Not with a jerk, not with panic, but with the fluid ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her wrist turned, a small movement, precise and practiced. In less than a second, she had reversed the grip. His hand was no longer on her, but his wrist was now locked in her grasp. The tendons in his arm tightened, his breath caught. He tried to pull away, but he had no leverage. The amusement in his face vanished. The bar was silent now. The second man, the bigger one, shifted forward as if about to react, but she didn't give him time. With another controlled motion, she adjusted her grip just enough to apply pressure. Not enough to break anything, not yet. Just enough to send a clear message. The man in her grasp sucked in a sharp breath, his lips parting as his body instinctively moved to relieve the strain. She let go. The sudden release made him stumble slightly, but he caught himself. His face was red, not just from the strain, but from the realization of what had just happened. The others at the table had gone completely still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone chuckled. It was soft, almost disbelieving, but it came from the table where the rest of the bikers sat. One of them, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, smirked slightly as he watched the scene unfold. He took a slow sip of his beer, his gaze shifting toward the man who had just been released. The message was clear. You just got put in your place. The man who had grabbed her clenched his jaw, his pride burning in his expression. The bigger one beside her looked from her to his companion, debating his next move. Ronda reached for her coffee again, lifting the cup as if nothing had happened. She knew they wouldn't let it go. Men like this never did. It was just a matter of how long it would take before they tried again. The tension in the bar had thickened, invisible but suffocating, wrapping itself around the space between them. The laughter had died. The murmured conversations had faded into nothing. Even the bartender, who had seen more bar fights than he could probably count, had stopped wiping the glass in his hand. He stood motionless, his gaze flicking between the woman at the bar and the men who now loomed over her. The man, whose wrist she had locked and released, was still standing too close. His expression was shifting rapidly, confusion melting into anger, humiliation twisting into something sharper. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one caught off guard, the one losing control of the situation. His pride had taken a hit, and men like him didn't take hits like that well. The bigger man beside him, the one who had been watching, waiting, weighing his options, finally made his decision. He shifted his weight forward, his heavy boots scuffing against the wooden floor as he moved. His presence alone was meant to intimidate. He towered over her, muscles thick beneath his jacket, hands curling into slow, deliberate fists. Ronda took another sip of her coffee. It was the smallest, simplest gesture, but it sent a message clearer than words. She wasn't concerned. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't bracing for a fight. She was waiting for them to make their next mistake. The first man, the one she had just released, clenched his jaw so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack under the pressure. His face was still flushed with the sting of embarrassment, his body tense with the need to reclaim whatever dignity he thought he had lost. He glanced toward the others at the table, seeking approval, searching for the permission to escalate. The man at the head of the group, the one who hadn't moved yet, the one whose presence alone had dictated the atmosphere of the room, gave a slight nod. That was all it took. The first attack was sloppy, born from frustration, not strategy. The man lashed out, reaching for her again, this time with force, his fingers aiming for her shoulder in a rough, controlling grip. He never made contact. Before his hand could close around her, Ronda moved. It wasn't a violent strike, not yet. It was controlled, precise. A shift of weight, a turn of her wrist, a redirection of movement. His own momentum was used against him, and in less than a second, his arm was twisted into a position that left his elbow dangerously close to snapping. A sharp, involuntary grunt left his lips as he dropped to one knee, his free hand clutching at the counter for balance. The bar collectively exhaled. Someone muttered something under their breath, something disbelieving, but no one else moved. They were watching now, waiting. The bigger man beside him didn't hesitate. He came in fast, using his size, his strength, trying to grab her, to overpower her. His mistake was thinking brute force alone would be enough. Ronda sidestepped effortlessly, his grasp catching only empty air. Before he could recover, before he could plant his feet again, her elbow drove into his ribs with the precision of a sledgehammer meeting steel. The impact was solid, controlled. It knocked the air from his lungs in a sharp, breathless wheeze. He stumbled back, his hands instinctively dropping to his side, his chest heaving as he tried to suck in the breath that had been stolen from him. The bar was no longer silent. There were whispers now, murmurs running through the crowd like electricity. The people at the nearby tables, some truckers, some locals, were no longer just passive observers. They were shifting in their seats, leaning in, glancing toward the table where the other bikers still sat. The leader of the group, the one who had given the nod, was watching carefully, his expression unreadable. But he wasn't stopping it. Not yet. The first man, still on his knee, still caught between disbelief and rage, finally found his voice. "What the—" He never finished his sentence. Ronda released his arm and moved in one fluid motion. Her foot hooked around his, a controlled sweep that took his balance completely. He hit the ground hard, his back colliding with the wooden floor in a dull, breath-stealing thud. Someone cursed under their breath. The bigger man, still gasping from the blow to his ribs, finally straightened. His face was red now, not just from the hit, but from the sheer disbelief of what had just happened. He had underestimated her. They all had. He adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders, resetting himself. This time, when he moved, he was more careful. He wasn't just relying on strength anymore. He was trying to be smart. It wouldn't matter. He threw a punch. It was fast, practiced. He knew how to fight. But she was faster. She ducked under his swing, shifting inside his reach before he could adjust. Her fist connected with his stomach, not wild, not reckless, but with precision, landing exactly where it needed to. His body folded on instinct, the impact knocking him forward, forcing him to stagger. And then she hit him again. An open palm strike, fast, brutal, right to his sternum. His breath left him in a strangled noise. His body reacted before his brain could catch up, his legs given out under him. He hit the ground beside the first man, both of them gasping, both of them momentarily unable to move. The bar was silent again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that came from waiting. It was the kind of silence that came from knowing. Knowing that something had shifted. Knowing that this wasn't going to end the way they had thought it would. The leader of the group, the man who had been watching from his seat, finally stood. The others at his table tensed. He didn't look at them. He looked only at her. And for the first time since she had walked into this place, something flickered in his expression. Respect, but also something colder. Something that said, "This isn't over." The leader of the bikers stood slowly, deliberately, his heavy boots scraping against the worn wooden floor as he pushed himself up from his seat. The room remained eerily silent, save for the labored breathing of the two men still on the ground. The others in the bar sat frozen, watching the unfolding scene with expressions that ranged from barely concealed amusement to thinly veiled tension. Some of them had probably seen fights in this place before, but not like this. Not with an outcome like this. Ronda remained still, her posture unchanged. She hadn't moved toward them, hadn't advanced in any way. The violence so far had been defensive, measured, effortless. The kind of skill that didn't come from wild bar brawls, but from years of training, from knowing exactly how much force was necessary and when to apply it. The leader, Roy, as the others had called him earlier, was older than the rest, his features weathered by experience. His gray-streaked beard framed a face that had likely seen more than its fair share of fights, and yet he wasn't charging in. He wasn't like the others, who had mistaken her silence for weakness, her disinterest for an opportunity. He had let them make their own mistakes, and now he stood watching, weighing his options. He cracked his neck once, rolling his shoulders. His jacket bore the same patches as the others, but his was more worn, the edges frayed, the fabric softened by years on the road. A leader, but not just in name. Someone who had earned his place through more than just words. He took a slow step forward, his gaze locked onto Ronda, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You fight clean," he said finally, his voice low and measured. She didn't respond. He nodded slightly, more to himself than to her, then glanced down at the two men still groaning on the floor. One of them was struggling to sit up, the other clutching his ribs, his breath still coming in short, uneven gasps. Roy exhaled through his nose, a sound that could have been amusement or frustration. He looked back at her, assessing her again, this time with a different kind of calculation. Not as a woman, not as an outsider, but as a fighter. Then he moved. He was fast, faster than the others, faster than a man his size should have been. His hands came up, his stance shifting as he closed the distance. But he wasn't fast enough. Ronda had already read him before he took his first step. She shifted just slightly, weight evenly balanced, her muscles loose but coiled, ready. The moment he lunged, she turned, sidestepping at the last possible second. His fist sliced through the air where she had been just a heartbeat before, but she was already inside his guard. Her elbow struck first, a sharp, calculated hit to his jaw. His head snapped to the side, but he didn't go down. He absorbed it, rolling with the impact, his footing steady. He was different from the others. He knew how to take a hit, knew how to recover. He came at her again, this time more controlled. A left hook, followed by a right. She ducked the first, redirected the second with a small movement of her forearm. He was powerful, but he wasn't reckless. He wasn't fighting out of rage or humiliation. He was testing her, feeling out her rhythm, searching for an opening. She didn't give him one. She countered with precision, her movements economical, efficient. A feint to the left, drawing him into shifting his balance just slightly. That was all she needed. Her foot hooked around his, sweeping his leg out from under him. He stumbled, not falling completely, but enough to break his stance. That half-second of imbalance was enough. She struck again, this time a clean hit to his ribs. His breath hitched, his expression tightening, but he didn't react outwardly. He didn't groan, didn't stagger back. He only adjusted. The fight should have continued longer, but Ronda had no interest in prolonging it. This wasn't a competition. This wasn't a ring with rounds and rules. She didn't need to prove anything. She moved before he could reset himself, closing the distance again, this time finishing it. A strike to the solar plexus, fast and brutal, knocking the air from his lungs. He coughed sharply, and as his body instinctively folded forward, her hand caught the back of his head, guiding him down just enough before she twisted his weight against him. His knee buckled, and in the next second, he was down. He landed on one knee, one hand braced against the floor, his breath ragged. His body told him to get up, but his mind had already registered what had happened. The fight was over. She stepped back, giving him space, but not because she was offering mercy. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was enough. The others at the table had stopped moving completely. The ones still standing hadn't made a sound. Even the bartender, who had remained unimpressed throughout the earlier exchanges, had finally set his glass down, watching with a quiet, knowing expression. Roy stayed where he was for a few beats longer, his head tilted downward, his breathing slowing. Then, finally, he lifted his gaze, looking up at her, and then he laughed. It wasn't bitter, wasn't resentful. It was low, almost breathless, the laugh of a man who understood exactly what had just happened. He nodded once, as if acknowledging something that didn't need to be spoken. Then he pushed himself up, slow but steady, rubbing his ribs once as he exhaled. "You're the real deal," he said. She didn't answer. He glanced at the others, the ones still on the floor, the ones standing, watching, waiting. "Let her go," he said simply. It wasn't a request. No one argued. She took one final look around, then turned. She walked back to the bar, picked up her coffee, and took a slow sip. No one stopped her. She placed a few bills on the counter, just enough to cover her drink. The bartender didn't speak, only nodded slightly as he picked them up. Then, without another word, she walked toward the door. The night air greeted her with silence. The neon sign above the entrance still flickered weakly, casting broken red light onto the parking lot. Behind her, the door remained open for a moment before swinging shut. She didn't look back. The bar remained in a state of stunned quiet even after the door swung shut behind her. The only sounds were the soft clinking of glasses, the distant hum of the jukebox, and the heavy breathing of the men who had just been put on the floor. The bartender, still holding the rag he had been using earlier, finally exhaled and set the glass down with a dull clunk. He had seen fights in this place before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. Roy, still standing, still rubbing his ribs where her final strike had landed, let out a slow breath. His face remained unreadable, but there was no anger in his expression, no lingering need to reestablish dominance. There was only acknowledgement. He had fought enough real fighters in his life to know when he'd been outclassed. This wasn't just some woman who knew how to throw a punch. This was someone who lived and breathed combat, someone whose entire body had been trained to dismantle opponents with precision. The men still on the floor slowly began to recover, shifting, groaning, dragging themselves upright with as much dignity as they could manage. The younger one, still clutching his ribs, wiped at his mouth, as if expecting to find blood there, then turned toward Roy, expecting orders. But there were none. Roy walked back toward the table, lowering himself carefully into his seat, wincing only slightly as his ribs protested. He took a long, steadying breath before finally reaching for his beer and taking a slow sip. The others hesitated, unsure whether to follow suit, whether to laugh it off or pretend it hadn't happened at all. The ones who had been hit the hardest weren't laughing. The bartender finally broke the silence, his voice low and dry. "You boys need another round?" Roy chuckled, shaking his head as he set his beer down. "I think we've had enough." The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering between each other, toward the door, toward Roy. One of them, the broad-shouldered one with a scar running down his forearm, spoke hesitantly. "You just gonna let that slide?" Roy didn't answer immediately. He took another sip, set his drink down again, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward the scarred man. "What exactly do you want me to do?" His tone was calm, measured, but there was a warning beneath it. The scarred man hesitated, then scoffed, shaking his head. "She made fools of us." Roy's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, we made fools of ourselves." No one responded. Across the bar, the two who had been thrown to the floor had finally regained their footing. They weren't looking at each other, weren't looking at anyone. They were just staring at the ground, at the space where the fight had happened, at the memories of what had unfolded there. One of the other men at the table leaned in, his voice quieter, more cautious. "People are gonna talk about this." Roy exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head with something almost like amusement. Let them. The reality of it settled over them like a weight. There was no way to spin this, no way to rewrite what had happened. The regulars in the bar had seen everything, and the ones who hadn't already pulled out their phones to record it would be talking about it for weeks. Word would spread. Stories about how a single woman had walked into their bar, taken them apart one by one, and left without so much as a scratch. Someone would turn it into a legend. Somewhere down the road, in another town, another bar, another night, someone would repeat the story, and by the time it reached the ears of people who hadn't been here, the details would grow wilder, more exaggerated. But those who had been present, those who had felt the force of her hands, of her movements, of her precision, would know the truth. The scarred man let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "Shit!" Roy leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His ribs still ached, but it wasn't the worst he'd ever taken. "You think she cares?" he asked, tilting his head toward the door. "She doesn't. She wasn't proving a point. She wasn't showing off. She was just handling it." The realization settled over the group like a heavy fog. She hadn't enjoyed it. She hadn't humiliated them for the sake of it. She had done what was necessary, nothing more. That was what made it worse. If she had gloated, if she had rubbed it in, it would have been easier to be angry, but she had treated it like it was nothing. Because to her it was. The bartender finally spoke again, his voice gruff but amused. "Maybe next time don't go picking fights with people you don't know." Roy smirked, reaching for his beer again. "Yeah," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Maybe next time." Across the bar, a few of the locals had started whispering among themselves, already reliving the scene, already sharing glances that said, "Did you see that?" The regulars who had been drinking quietly in their booths were now leaning in, replaying every moment, making sure no detail was forgotten. The men at Roy's table knew they had just become a story. A few of them weren't sure what to do with that. The man, still rubbing his ribs, let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "I ever see her again, I'm going the other way." No one argued. Roy leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before muttering under his breath, "Smartest thing you've said all night." The night air was cool against Ronda's skin as she stepped onto the gravel parking lot. The neon sign above the bar flickering weakly, its red glow casting distorted shadows across the rows of parked motorcycles and trucks. The noise from inside had died down, replaced by the steady hum of cicadas in the distance and the occasional rumble of an engine from the highway beyond. She didn't rush. She had no reason to. Her steps remained measured, unhurried, just as they had been when she entered. Nothing about her posture had changed. She wasn't rattled, wasn't tense, wasn't even particularly interested in what had just transpired. It had happened. It was over. And now she was leaving. The heavy steel door of the bar remained shut behind her, but she could still feel the weight of their stares through the walls, could still hear the echoes of their silence. Inside, they were probably still trying to process it, still trying to decide how to frame it in their minds. Some of them would twist the story, convince themselves that they had let her win, that they had gone easy. Others would remain quiet, unwilling to admit, even to themselves, that they had never stood a chance. It didn't matter. She had nothing to prove. Her car sat where she had left it, dust settling on the windshield from the long stretch of road behind her. The keys felt cool in her hand as she approached, unlocking the door with a quiet click. She paused for a moment, glancing back toward the bar one last time, not out of hesitation, but out of instinct. A few of the locals had stepped outside now, lingering near their cars, pretending to talk amongst themselves while sneaking glances in her direction. They weren't part of the fight, weren't involved in any way, but they had seen enough to know they had just witnessed something they would be telling people about for years. Some of them had their phones in their hands, whether to text someone or record another moment just in case. She ignored them. Sliding into the driver's seat, she adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit, her reflection catching her eyes for a split second. There was no adrenaline spike, no lingering tension in her muscles, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had just happened. That was the difference between her and them. For her, this wasn't an event. It was just another night. The engine came to life with a steady purr. The low hum of the radio filtered through the speakers, soft and unobtrusive, filling the space around her with the familiar comfort of motion. She had spent more time on the road than anywhere else, and there was something grounding about it. Something that had nothing to do with the destination and everything to do with the rhythm of the journey itself. As she pulled out onto the empty highway, the bar shrank in her rearview mirror, its neon glow fading into the distance. She didn't look back again. Inside, the men she had left behind were still sitting in the aftermath, their voices low, their movements slow. The bartender had resumed his quiet routine, washing glasses, wiping down the counter as if nothing had happened. The ones who had been put on the floor were nursing their bruises, staring down at the scuffed wood as if it held answers they hadn't yet found. Roy sat back in his chair, his beer still in hand, the weight of the night pressing into his ribs with every breath. He had taken his fair share of losses before, but this one was different. This wasn't just a fight he had lost. This was a reminder. A reminder that there was always someone stronger. A reminder that power didn't come from size, from numbers, from the weight of a name patched onto a leather jacket. It came from something deeper, something forged through discipline, through control, through the ability to walk into a room without the need to prove anything to anyone. And she had walked out just as easily as she had walked in. The men at the table weren't speaking much anymore. What was there to say? They had all felt it, the shift in the air, the way the room had changed the moment she had moved. There was nothing to argue, no excuses that would make sense. One of them exhaled, shaking his head as he reached for his drink. She didn't even break a sweat. Roy didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. Somewhere out on the road, the woman they had tried to intimidate was already gone, already miles away, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already elsewhere. She wouldn't remember them, but they would remember her, and they would never forget. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and check out our other content for more exciting stories. Don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can experience it too.